In the sun-baked town of Copper Creek, where cattle drives and copper mines shaped destinies, stood Miss Eleanor Hayes, all 4 feet 11 inches of her. She'd traveled 2,000 miles west with a mail-order bride contract in her pocket, and hope in her heart, only to face sneers and whispers about her height. As she prepared to board the next stage out of town, her trunk packed with shattered dreams, a shadow fell across her path. Thomas Montgomery, the wealthiest rancher in 3 counties, wasn't known for his height, but for the size of his heart. He'd seen something in Eleanor's eyes that measured far taller than any ruler could capture. What secret from Thomas's past made him the only man in Copper Creek who could truly see her worth? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The stagecoach rattled to a stop in a cloud of ochre dust, and Eleanor Hayes clutched her mother's silver locket, thumb running over its worn surface. Inside, carefully preserved behind glass, was a miniature portrait of the family she'd left behind in Boston, their last gift before she'd embarked on this journey west. "Copper Creek," the driver announced, his voice carrying the weariness of 2 days' hard travel. Eleanor gathered her skirts, careful not to let them drag in the mud that lingered from yesterday's rain. As she reached for the door handle, a gentleman's voice called out, "Allow me, miss." The door swung open to reveal a middle-aged man with kind eyes and silver at his temples. "Welcome to Copper Creek. I'm Dr. Wilson." He offered his hand, then paused, blinking twice as Eleanor stepped down. Even with the coach's bottom step, she barely reached his shoulder. "Miss Eleanor Hayes," she replied, lifting her chin with the quiet dignity her mother had instilled in her. "I'm here to meet Mrs. Whitaker." "Ah, the matchmaker." Something flickered across the doctor's face, concern perhaps, or pity. Eleanor had seen that look before, had learned to steel herself against it. "Her office is just down the street, past the general store." Eleanor retrieved her trunk, a modest thing that held everything she deemed worth bringing to her new life. The doctor moved to help, but she shook her head with a smile. "I manage quite well, thank you." She'd learned long ago that being small didn't mean being helpless. The main street of Copper Creek stretched before her, a mixture of wooden boardwalks and rutted dirt, lined with false-fronted buildings that reached toward the vast Montana sky. Women in practical calico dresses hurried about their errands, while cowboys lounged outside the saloon, their spurs catching the late afternoon sun. Eleanor's fingers found the locket again, drawing strength from its familiar weight. "You'd be proud, Mama," she whispered. "Your little girl made it all the way west." The word little caught in her throat, but she pushed past it. Height hadn't stopped her from graduating top of her class at the Women's Academy, or from managing her father's books when his eyes began to fail. She spotted Mrs. Whitaker's office, a neat white building with green trim and a small brass plaque. Through the window she could see a woman with elaborately styled grey hair bent over a desk. Eleanor took a deep breath, straightened her travel-worn jacket, and pushed open the door. The bell's cheerful tinkle announced her arrival. Mrs. Whitaker looked up, her professional smile freezing slightly as she took in Eleanor's diminutive stature. "Miss Hayes, I presume." The matchmaker's voice held a note of dismay that Eleanor recognized all too well. "Your letters were so well written, I had assumed." She trailed off, shuffling through papers on her desk. "Yes, Mrs. Whitaker, I have my contract here." Eleanor withdrew the carefully preserved document from her reticule. Her hand trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady. "I understand you have several gentlemen interested in meeting potential brides." Mrs. Whitaker accepted the contract, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Miss Hayes, I feel I must be honest with you. The men out here, they're looking for sturdy wives, women who can handle the physical demands of ranch life." Eleanor's fingers tightened around her mother's locket. "I assure you, what I lack in height, I make up for in determination and capability." But Mrs. Whitaker was already shaking her head. "Perhaps Perhaps we should discuss alternative arrangements. The school might need an assistant teacher, or, outside the window, a tall man rode past on a magnificent black stallion. He sat straight in the saddle, authority in every line of his form. For just a moment his gaze met Eleanor's through the glass, and something passed between them. A flash of recognition, though of what, she couldn't say. Then he was gone, leaving Eleanor to face Mrs. Whittaker's gentle rejection and the growing realization that her dreams of finding a place to belong might have died before they truly began. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, bringing with it the steady stream of potential suitors Mrs. Whittaker had arranged to meet. Eleanor sat straight-backed in the matchmaker's parlor, her mother's locket providing cold comfort as man after man took one look at her and found somewhere else to be. "Perhaps if you stood," Mrs. Whittaker suggested helplessly to Eleanor after. The third man made his excuses. "I assure you, Mrs. Whittaker, standing won't add the 6 inches they seem to require." Eleanor's voice remained level, though her fingers trembled as they smoothed her skirts. The door opened, admitting a tall man with weathered features. "Jim Hawkins," he announced, then stopped short. "Ma'am, there must be some mistake." "No mistake, Mr. Hawkins," Eleanor said, rising to her full height, such as it was. "I'm the one who wrote about having experience with bookkeeping and animal husbandry." He shifted uncomfortably. "Didn't expect... Well, meaning no offense, but I need someone who can reach the top shelf in the kitchen without a ladder." After he left, Mrs. Whittaker disappeared into her back office, returning with a hand-lettered sign that made Eleanor's heart sink further. "Notice: all potential brides must meet minimum height requirements for ranch work." "I'm sorry, dear," the matchmaker said, propping the sign in her window, "but we must be practical. These men need wives who can handle the physical demands of frontier life." Eleanor watched as Mrs. Whittaker added measurements to the sign that might as well have been a gate closing her out of the life she'd dreamed of. "My father's ranch in Boston," she began. "This isn't Boston," a new voice interrupted. Clayton Pierce stood in the doorway, his expensive suit marking him as one of the territory's successful mine owners. "Out here, we need women of substance." His eyes raked dismissively over Eleanor's small frame. "Though I suppose you could find work in the mining office. We need someone to crawl into the small spaces with the account books." Heat flooded Eleanor's cheeks, but she lifted her chin. "I prefer the open air, Mr. Pierce." "Suit yourself." He turned to Mrs. Whittaker. "Speaking of suits, I'm still waiting to meet that Boston heiress you mentioned in your letter, the one with the substantial dowry." Eleanor gathered her reticule, unable to bear another moment of being discussed as though she were a defective piece of merchandise. Outside, the morning bustle of Copper Creek continued, unaware of her humiliation. Women carried baskets of fresh bread and produce, their skirts swishing efficiently around their ankles that, Eleanor noted with bitter humor, were all at least a foot higher off the ground than her own. She was so lost in her thoughts that she nearly collided with a group of cowboys emerging from the general store. "Watch where you're—" "Oh!" One of them stopped short, peering down at her. "You must be the little lady from the matchmakers. Boys, come see what the East sent us." Laughter rippled through the group. Eleanor clutched her mother's locket, wishing she could disappear into it like the tiny painted figures inside. Then a shadow fell across the boardwalk, and the laughter died. "Something amusing, gentlemen?" The voice was deep, quietly authoritative. Eleanor turned to find the man she'd seen yesterday on the black stallion. Up close, he was less imposing, in height than she'd imagined, though still tall enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "Mr. Montgomery?" one of the cowboys mumbled. "No, sir, just leaving, I believe." There was no overt threat in his tone, but the cowboys scattered like leaves in a wind. Eleanor straightened her shoulders. "Thank you, Mr. Montgomery, but I don't need—" "Thomas?" he interrupted, then smiled slightly at her startled look. "My name is Thomas, and I know you don't need rescuing, Miss Hayes, Eleanor Hayes." She waited for the familiar flicker of surprise. The measuring... Look, it didn't come. Instead, he gestured to Mrs. Whittaker's window. Interesting sign. Though I've found that measuring someone's worth by inches is about as useful as measuring a horse's spirit by the size of its stall. Before Eleanor could respond, Mrs. Whittaker appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Montgomery, I had no idea you were... That is, we don't often see you in town. Were you perhaps interested in discussing potential matches?" Thomas's eyes never left Eleanor's face. "Perhaps I am, Mrs. Whittaker. Perhaps I am." The black stallion stood tethered outside Mrs. Whittaker's office, its silver-studded bridle catching the morning light. Eleanor had never seen such intricate leatherwork. Each concho had been carefully shaped into a delicate mountain flower, no two exactly alike. "His name is Midnight," Thomas said, watching her study the horse. "Would you like to meet him properly?" Eleanor hesitated. The stallion's withers stood well above her head, his powerful frame making her feel even smaller than usual. But there was something in Thomas's quiet offer that made her step forward. "He's magnificent," she said, reaching up to let Midnight catch her scent. The stallion lowered his great head, nickering softly. "He knows quality when he sees it." Thomas's voice held no mockery, only a simple statement of fact. "Most people are too intimidated to approach him. He doesn't suffer fools gladly." Mrs. Whittaker appeared in the doorway, wringing her hands. "Mr. Montgomery, surely you don't intend, that is, with your standing in the community—" "My standing?" Thomas raised an eyebrow. "You mean my bank account, I suppose? Or the size of my ranch?" "Well, yes, and—" The matchmaker's eyes darted to Eleanor, who pretended to be absorbed in stroking Midnight's velvet nose. "Mrs. Whittaker," Thomas said quietly, "I've found that ledgers don't measure what matters most. My father taught me that, though it took me years to understand it." He turned to Eleanor. "Miss Hayes, would you do me the honor of riding with me? I'd like to show you something." Eleanor glanced at the stallion's imposing height, then back at Thomas. "I'm not sure I could—" He smiled, and the expression transformed his serious face. "I have a few tricks for that. If you trust me?" She did, she realized with surprise. Despite having just met him, something about his steady presence felt more reliable than all the polite dismissals she'd endured since arriving. "I trust you," she said. Thomas led Midnight to a water trough that stood at the perfect height for a mounting block. With gentle efficiency, he helped Eleanor arrange her skirts and settle side saddle before swinging up behind her. The position should have made her uncomfortable. It was hardly proper, but his respectful distance and the secure feeling of his arms reaching around her to hold the reins put her at ease. Mrs. Whittaker's scandalized gasp faded behind them as Midnight carried them down the main street. Eleanor felt the curious stares of townspeople, heard the whispers start up in their wake, but for once she didn't shrink from the attention. "My ranch lies west of town," Thomas said as they cleared the last buildings. "But first, I'd like to show you what made me fall in love with this country." The trail wound up through scrub-covered hills, each turn revealing new vistas. Eleanor had expected Montana to be beautiful, but nothing had prepared her for the majesty of the mountains rising purple against the horizon, or the way the spring grass rippled like waves in the wind. "It's breathtaking," she whispered. "Most people see the harshness first," Thomas said, "the distance between towns, the unforgiving weather. But there's a poetry to it, if you know how to look, like that cloud shadow racing across the valley." Eleanor pointed to where darkness and light chased each other across the landscape. She felt, rather than saw, his smile. Exactly like that. "You have a keen eye, Miss Hayes." "Eleanor," she offered, "since we're being informal enough to share a horse." The trail opened onto a high meadow carpeted with wildflowers. Thomas drew Midnight to a halt, and they sat in companionable silence, watching red-tailed hawks circle overhead. "You're wondering why I intervened back there," he said finally. "The thought had crossed my mind. I saw something familiar in your eyes, the look of someone who spent too long being measured by the wrong yardstick." He paused. Would you like to hear a story about a boy who was told he'd never amount to much because he couldn't read the words in his school books properly? Eleanor turned slightly to look at him. What happened to him? His father taught him there were different ways to read, the lay of land, the health of cattle, the character of men. That boy grew up to own the largest ranch in 3 counties. His voice held no pride, only quiet acknowledgement. But he never forgot what it was like to be judged by a single measure and found wanting. Understanding bloomed in Eleanor's chest, warm and unexpected as the spring flowers surrounding them. And now he's trying to teach that lesson to others, only to those wise enough to already know its truth. Thomas gathered the reins. Now, would you like to see what a real Montana ranch looks like? I warn you, it's not as neat as those eastern establishments. Eleanor settled more comfortably against the saddle. I'd like that very much. The Montgomery Ranch spread across the valley like a kingdom, its fence lines disappearing into the distance. Cattle dotted the emerald spring grass, their rich brown hides gleaming in the afternoon sun. As they approached the main house, Eleanor noticed how the buildings had been arranged with careful thought. The barn positioned to block the worst of the winter winds, the corrals angled to catch the morning light. Welcome to Silver Creek Ranch, Thomas said as they rode into the yard. A weathered man in his 60s emerged from the barn, his lined face breaking into a smile. Boss, didn't expect you back, so... He stopped short at the sight of Eleanor, but his surprise quickly transformed into a warm welcome. Well now, what have we here? Miss Eleanor Hayes, meet Frank Miller, my foreman and oldest friend. Thomas dismounted smoothly, then helped Eleanor down with careful dignity. Frank's been with the ranch since before I could reach the stirrups. And that wasn't so long ago as some might think, Frank chuckled. Come on inside, Miss Hayes. Martha's just pulled a fresh apple pie from the oven. The ranch house kitchen was a marvel of practical beauty, with gleaming copper pots and bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters. Martha Miller, Frank's wife, greeted Eleanor with the same easy warmth as her husband. Sit, she insisted, pulling out a chair. You must be exhausted from the ride. Actually, Eleanor said, accepting a slice of pie, I found it invigorating, though I admit I've never ridden quite like that before. Boss, Frank said, speaking of riding, that new stallion's giving us trouble. Won't let anyone near him with a saddle. Thomas nodded. We'll look at him after lunch. Miss Hayes, would you care to observe? I have a feeling you might have some insight. Before Eleanor could respond, Martha was already wrapping a second slice of pie. Take it with you to the study first. Thomas, show her the ledgers while Frank and I tend to things. Thomas led Eleanor down a hallway to a room lined with bookshelves. An enormous desk dominated one corner, its surface neat but well used. He pulled a leather-bound book from a shelf, its pages soft with age. The first ledger my father kept, he explained, laying it carefully on the desk. He started with 12 head of cattle, and more dreams than sense, according to my mother. Eleanor leaned forward, instantly recognizing the careful columns of numbers and notes. But something was different about the way they were arranged. These aren't standard accounting entries. No, Thomas smiled. My father developed his own system. You see, when I was young, letters would sometimes jump around on the page for me. Numbers, too. He figured out that if we organized them differently, he traced a pattern on the page. The information was easier for me to grasp. Eleanor studied the elegant solution. He turned the limitations into an advantage. Each entry tells a story, not just about money, but about the weather, the cattle's health, even which hands were working that day. Most people just see messy bookkeeping, Thomas said quietly. You're the first to understand it right away. She looked up to find him watching her with an intensity that made her heart skip. Because it's brilliant. You can track patterns this way, that's standard. Ledgers would miss. Her fingers traced a series of entries. See here, you predicted the drought of 21 3 months before it hit. We did, he acknowledged. Sold off the extra stock early, bought feed when prices were low. It saved the ranch while others struggled. He turned a page. After my father passed, I kept his system, added to it. The bank thought I was crazy at first, but the results spoke for themselves," Eleanor finished, seeing the steady growth documented in the careful columns. She understood now how this man had built his empire, not through inheritance or luck, but through intelligence and determination. "Miss Hayes," Thomas paused, then continued, "Eleanor, would you be interested in seeing more of how we run things here? Frank and Martha have a spare room, if you'd like to stay a few days. Completely proper, of course." Eleanor thought of Mrs. Whittaker's dismissive looks, of the sneering cowboys in town. Then she thought of how Thomas had seen past her height, to recognize something in her that others missed, just as she had seen past his different way of reading, to recognize his brilliance. "I would like that very much," she said softly, "though I warn you, I may have quite a few questions about your accounting system." His smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "I look forward to every one of them. Now, shall we see about that troublesome stallion?" 3 days into Eleanor's stay at Silver Creek Ranch, Martha Miller brought in the weekly edition of the Copper Creek Chronicle, her usually cheerful face creased with concern. The paper was folded to show a column titled "Local Happenings" by Miss Augusta Prendergast. "You might want to see this," Martha said, setting it beside Eleanor's morning coffee. Eleanor picked up the paper, her heart sinking as she read. "Certain elements of our respectable community have been shocked by recent developments at the Montgomery Ranch. The wealthy and eligible Mr. Thomas Montgomery, whose business acumen has been extensively documented in these pages, appears to have taken in a diminutive Eastern miss of questionable background. One must wonder what design such a person might have on our most prosperous citizen." "Ridiculous," Martha snorted, pulling biscuits from the oven with more force than necessary. "As if Thomas hasn't turned away every fortune hunter in the territory." Eleanor set the paper down carefully, her fingers finding her mother's locket. "Perhaps I should return to town. I don't want to cause trouble for Thomas." "And prove Augusta Prendergast right." Martha placed a warm biscuit on Eleanor's plate. "That woman's been trying to marry her niece to Thomas for 3 years. Besides," she added with a knowing smile, "I've seen how he looks at you when you're working with that wild stallion." It was true. Over the past days, Eleanor had discovered a gift for gentle persuasion with the horses. Her size, which had been such a liability in town, proved an advantage in the corral. The nervous stallion that had fought every handler now accepted her approach, perhaps seeing her as less threatening than the tall cowboys. "Miss Hayes." Thomas's voice from the doorway made both women turn. He held another newspaper in his hand, this one yellowed with age. "I thought you might like to see this. It's from when I first started expanding the ranch." The headline, "Read, Local Ranchers' Unusual Methods Raise Eyebrows." Below was a younger Thomas, standing proud beside his father's modest herd. "They said I was fool-headed," he continued, pulling out a chair. "That my different way of doing things would ruin me. 5 years later, they were all copying my methods." He met Eleanor's eyes. "The thing about small towns, Miss Hayes, is they fear what they don't understand, until they do understand it. Then they pretend they knew its value all along. Like your accounting system? Like a woman who knows her own worth, regardless of how others measure it." He spread butter on a biscuit with deliberate care. "I'm riding out to the north pasture today. There's a line shack needs checking. Would you care to accompany me?" Eleanor knew what the town would say about such an excursion. She could almost hear Miss Prendergast's scandalized gossip, but she also knew that in 3 days she'd felt more at home on this ranch than she had anywhere since leaving Boston. "I'll pack us a lunch," Martha said before Eleanor could respond. "Frank's been meaning to repair that back window in the shack anyway. He'll ride up later." And so, an hour later, Eleanor found herself once again mounted behind Thomas on midnight, breathing in the sage-scented morning air. This time, though, she felt none of the uncertainty of that first ride. Her body had learned to move with the horse's stride, and her heart had learned to trust the man who guided them through the rolling hills. "You know," Thomas said as they crested a rise overlooking a green valley, "I've been thinking about expanding the breeding program. We could use someone with a good eye for horseflesh and a gentle hand with the nervous ones." Eleanor smiled, understanding the offer hidden in his words. "Would this position include access to those fascinating ledgers of yours? If the candidate were qualified in bookkeeping as well as horse whispering?" His voice held a warmth that had nothing to do with the morning sun. "I believe that could be arranged." The morning sun hadn't yet cleared the mountains when Eleanor discovered the gift outside her door. A beautifully crafted mounting block stood in the yard, its solid oak construction disguising its elegant design. 3 graduated steps, each one cunningly carved with a mountain flower pattern that matched Midnight's bridle, led to a sturdy platform. "Do you like it?" Thomas's voice came from the barn doorway. He stepped into the dawn light, wiping his hands on a cloth. "I noticed you studying the height of the horses yesterday." Eleanor ran her hand over the smooth wood, feeling the care in every detail. "It's beautiful, but you didn't have to." "I wanted to." He moved closer, his voice softening. "Everyone deserves the tools to do what they're capable of. Besides," a smile touched his eyes, "I can't always be around to help you mount, much as I might wish to be." A throat cleared behind them. Clayton Pierce stood at the yard gate, his expensive suit already gathering dust from the road. "Well, isn't this cozy? The whole town's talking about your unusual arrangement here, Montgomery." Thomas's expression cooled, but his voice remained civil. "Clayton, what brings you out so early?" "Business." Pierce's eyes fixed on Eleanor. "Though I'm surprised to find you entertaining, especially given the recent newspaper coverage." "Miss Hayes is helping with our horse breeding program," Thomas said evenly. "She has a remarkable touch with the more challenging animals." Pierce's laugh held no humor. "Is that what we're calling it now? Though I suppose even a man of your standing might be lonely enough to—" "Mr. Pierce," Eleanor's quiet voice cut through his insinuation, "I believe you'll find the ranch office opens at 9. If you have business to discuss, I'd be happy to review the accounts with you then." Something ugly flickered across Pierce's face. "You're letting her handle the books? Montgomery, have you lost your mind?" "Miss Hayes is more than qualified." Thomas's tone held a warning. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we have work to attend to." After Pierce left, Eleanor turned to the mounting block, her cheeks still burning. Without a word, she gathered her skirts and climbed the steps, settling herself expertly onto the back of the waiting mare, a gentle bay Thomas had assigned her. "Shall we see to that new foal?" she asked, gathering the reins. Thomas's pride was evident as he mounted Midnight. "Lead the way." Throughout the morning, Eleanor proved herself more than capable. She helped deliver medicine to a sick calf, assisted with training the nervous stallion, and demonstrated her growing skill with the ranch's unique bookkeeping system. If her hands sometimes shook when she remembered Pierce's sneering face, she steadied them by touching her mother's locket, or running her fingers over the carved flowers on her mounting block. During the noon break, as they sat in the shade of a cottonwood tree, Thomas finally spoke of what had been bothering him. "Pierce isn't just here about business. He's been buying up struggling ranches, using the drought as leverage." "The drought that your father's accounting system helped you predict," Eleanor noted. "Yes, he's tried to convince me to sell several times." Thomas absently stroked Midnight's nose. "Keeps talking about modernization, efficiency, but I've seen how he runs. His mind's no regard for the land or the people who work it." Eleanor thought of the careful notes in the ledgers, recording not just profits but rainfall patterns, cattle health, and the welfare of every ranch hand. "He'd destroy everything you've built, everything my father built," Thomas corrected. Gently, "I just expanded on his vision." He turned to face her fully. "Eleanor, I need to ask you something. These past weeks, you've shown an understanding of this place that goes beyond mere business. Would you consider, that is, would you be interested in a more permanent position here?" Her heart leapt, but years of being judged made her cautious. "What kind of position did you have in mind?" Before he could answer, a ranch hand came galloping up. "Boss, Pierce's men are moving cattle across the north boundary line." Thomas was on his feet instantly. "Eleanor, go," she said, already mounting her mare using the block. "I'll alert Frank and the others." As they rode in opposite directions, Eleanor realized something had shifted. She was no longer the uncertain mail-order bride seeking approval. She had found her place, not despite her size, but because of all the qualities that made her who she was. And if Clayton Pierce thought he could threaten that, he was about to learn that the smallest packages often contained the strongest. Still, Eleanor sat at Thomas's desk, surrounded by ledgers and property maps, her own neat account book open before her. While Thomas and the hands dealt with Pierce's men at the boundary, she had work of her own to do. Her fingers traced across the entries, following the patterns Thomas's father had created and his son had perfected. "There," she murmured, marking a page with her finger. "That's what he's after." Martha appeared in the doorway with coffee. "Found something? Look at this." Eleanor pointed to a series of entries. "The creek that runs through the north pasture. It's not just water rights. According to these surveys, there are copper deposits all along that ridge. Pierce isn't after grazing land at all." "That snake," Martha said, setting down the coffee cup with a sharp clink. "He's trying to steal mining rights." Eleanor was already pulling out more papers. "And that's not all. See these weather patterns? The droughts. Breaking. Pierce knows it. That's why he's moving now, before the land values recover." She opened her own account book, where she'd been tracking local property sales since arriving. Every transaction, every shift in market prices, carefully noted in her precise hand. A pattern emerged. Pierce had been systematically buying land around Silver Creek Ranch, piece by piece. "He's boxing us in," she realized. "If he controls the water rights—" Hoofbeats in the yard interrupted her. Thomas strode in, his face dark with anger. "Pierce's men pulled back, but they're claiming there's a dispute over the boundary line. Says his deed shows the creek is his." Eleanor finished. "That's what he wants you to think." She spread out the papers. "But look at these original surveys. The boundary markers were moved recently. See the fresh soil disturbance in Frank's report? And here," she flipped through her account book, 3 suspicious property transfers, all using the same notary, all changing hands just before Pierce bought them. Thomas leaned over her shoulder, his presence warm and solid. "Eleanor, you're brilliant." He studied the evidence she'd compiled. "With this, we can challenge his claims legally. But why go to all this trouble? The grazing isn't worth—" "Copper," Eleanor and Martha said together. "There's a copper vein running through that ridge," Eleanor explained. "Your father suspected it years ago. It's coded into these ledger entries. He didn't pursue it because he valued the water for ranching more than any mineral rights." Thomas straightened, understanding dawning. "So when Pierce couldn't buy us out directly, he tried to steal what he couldn't buy," Eleanor finished. "But he didn't count on someone understanding your father's unique bookkeeping system." Their eyes met, and something electric passed between them. Then Frank burst in, bringing the smell of horse and dust. "Pierce is in town, meeting with his lawyer. Word is, he's filing an injunction." "Let him," Thomas said, still looking at Eleanor. "Miss Hayes has just handed us everything we need to stop him." Eleanor closed her account book, suddenly self-conscious. "I simply followed the patterns. Your father's system made it possible to see what others missed." "No," Thomas said softly. "You saw what others missed because you know what it's like to be underestimated, just as you saw value in a different way of keeping books or in a rancher who reads differently than most." Martha and Frank exchanged knowing looks and quietly slipped out, leaving Eleanor and Thomas alone in the study. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, turning the dust motes to gold. "Miss Hayes," Thomas began then. "Eleanor, I need to tell you something." He moved around the desk to face her. "When you first arrived in Copper Creek, I saw something in you that reminded me of this ranch, something beautiful and strong that others were too blind to value properly. These past weeks, watching you work, seeing how you understand not just the books but the heart of this place." He gestured to the papers spread across the desk. You've protected my father's legacy better than I ever could alone. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she stacked the ledgers. The ranch is worth protecting. It's become... She paused, gathering courage. It's become home. Then stay, Thomas said quietly. Not as an employee, not as someone who has to prove their worth. Stay as... He took a deep breath. Stay as my wife, if you'll have me. Before Eleanor could respond, a commotion erupted in the yard. They rushed to the window to see Clayton Pierce riding up, a document held high in his hand like a battle flag. Looks like he's brought that injunction, Thomas said grimly. Eleanor squared her shoulders. Then let's show him exactly what he's up against. She gathered her account book and the evidence she'd compiled. Together, the summer social was Copper Creek's grandest annual event, transforming the town hall into a glittering approximation of an Eastern ballroom. Eleanor stood before the mirror in Martha's spare room, smoothing the sage-green silk of her best dress, the one she'd packed with such hope for her new life out west. You look lovely, Martha said, adjusting the pearl combs in Eleanor's carefully arranged hair. Though you might want this too. She held out a dance card on a silk ribbon, its ivory surface still pristine. Eleanor took it with trembling fingers. After the past weeks of ranch work and legal battles, the thought of facing Copper Creek society seemed more daunting than breaking any wild stallion. Remember, Martha said, reading her expression, you're the woman who uncovered Clayton Pierce's scheme and saved Silver Creek Ranch. You have nothing to prove to these people. A soft knock interrupted them. Thomas stood in the doorway, resplendent in a black suit that made him look every inch the wealthy rancher he was. But it was his expression when he saw Eleanor that made her breath catch. Miss Hayes, he said, softly, you put the sunset to shame. They rode into town in Thomas's best buggy, Eleanor's dance card already bearing his name in his careful handwriting. The first dance was his by right as her escort, but he'd also claimed the supper dance. And the last waltz, the rest remained empty, a fact that would normally have mortified her, but somehow didn't matter anymore. The town hall blazed with lamplight, bunting and summer flowers decorating every surface. As they entered, the music faltered briefly, conversations stuttering to a halt before resuming with increased intensity. Eleanor felt the weight of every stare, heard the whispers behind fluttering fans. My goodness! Augusta Prendergast's voice carried clearly from nearby. I had no idea the circus was in town. Ignore them, Thomas murmured, leading Eleanor onto the dance floor. They're just jealous that I'm dancing with the most capable woman in the territory. As they moved through the waltz, Eleanor gradually relaxed into the familiar steps. Thomas was an excellent dancer, adjusting his stride naturally to match her shorter one. They moved together as easily as they had on horseback, finding a rhythm that made their height difference seem irrelevant. Well, if it isn't the lovely Miss Hayes, Clayton Pierce's voice interrupted them between dances. I trust you're enjoying your temporary position at Silver Creek Ranch? Miss Hayes's position is permanent, Thomas said firmly. In fact, Thomas, a willowy young woman in an elaborate pink gown, swooped in. You simply must dance with Emily. She's been practicing her waltz for weeks, haven't you, dear? Miss Emily Prendergast, Augusta's niece, simpered appropriately. Oh, Mamma, you're embarrassing me. Eleanor felt Thomas tense beside her. Before he could respond, she touched his arm gently. You should dance with Miss Prendergast. I need to rest a moment anyway. But as Thomas reluctantly led Emily onto the floor, Pierce stepped closer. You know, my offer still stands. A woman of your stature might find the mining office more suitable than playing rancher's wife. Mr. Pierce, Eleanor said calmly, a man of your business acumen should know when he's beaten. Or do you need to review those property documents again? His face darkened. You think you're very clever, don't you? But Thomas Montgomery deserves a proper wife, someone who can stand beside him without making him look foolish. The only foolish thing, came Thomas's voice from behind them, would be letting Others decide what I deserve. He had returned, leaving Emily Prendergast stranded mid-dance. Pierce, I believe you were just leaving. This isn't over, Montgomery. Actually, it is. Thomas turned to Eleanor, holding out his hand. Miss Hayes, would you do me the honor of this dance? And perhaps every dance hereafter? Understanding dawned in Eleanor's heart as he led her back to the floor. The music swelled, not a waltz this time, but a sweet, slow melody that allowed him to draw her closer than strictly proper. Did you mean that? She whispered. Every dance hereafter. I meant to do this properly, he admitted. Not here with Pierce and the Prendergasts watching, but seeing you tonight, so strong and dignified despite their pettiness. He took a deep breath. Eleanor Hayes, I love you, not in spite of who you are, but because of it. Will you? Yes, she said, her heart soaring. Yes to every dance, every day for the rest of our lives. The music played on, but they hardly heard it. Around them the whispers grew to a crescendo as words spread through the hall. But for once, Eleanor didn't care about her height, or what anyone thought of. In Thomas's arms, she felt exactly as tall as she needed to be. The day after the summer social, Eleanor was organizing Thomas's study when she found the photograph tucked between the pages of an old ledger. The image was faded but clear, a younger Thomas standing beside a tall, elegant woman in a wedding dress. They were both smiling, his face unlined by the years that would follow. Her name was Catherine. Thomas's quiet voice made Eleanor start. He stood in the doorway, his expression gentle. I should have told you about her sooner. Eleanor carefully set down the photograph. She was beautiful. She was. Thomas crossed the room, picking up the image with careful fingers. We were married for 8 months before the fever took her. That was 12 years ago. I'm so sorry. Eleanor's hand found her mother's locket, understanding now why Thomas sometimes got a faraway look when studying the western horizon. I was angry for a long time, he continued, settling into his chair. Not at her, at God, at fate, at myself for not being able to save her. She was the banker's daughter, you see. Everyone said we were perfectly matched. Eleanor's heart twinged. Because of her height? Because of everything society valued, her family's standing, her classical education, her proper Western upbringing. He set the photograph down. But do you know what I remember most? How she laughed at my terrible jokes, how she insisted on learning to ride astride instead of side saddle, how she saw past what everyone expected her to be. Their eyes met across, the desk, understanding flowing between them. Like you did with me, Eleanor said softly. Catherine taught me to look past surfaces. When she died, I thought I'd never find that kind of understanding again. He reached across the desk, taking Eleanor's hand. Until I saw you standing in Mrs. Whitaker's office, chin raised despite everyone's judgment. Eleanor squeezed his fingers, but doubt crept into her heart. Thomas, are you sure about us? I'm not tall and elegant like Catherine. I can't help thinking that perhaps Miss Prendergast would be more suitable. Eleanor. He stood, circling the desk to kneel beside her chair. I loved Catherine for who she was, and I love you for who you are. Different people, different loves, both real. He touched her cheek gently. When I lost her, I thought my heart would never heal. But you didn't just heal it. You showed me it could grow bigger, love differently, but just as deeply. Tears pricked Eleanor's eyes. I wish I could have known her. She would have liked you. Thomas smiled. She had no patience for people who measured others by anything but their character. He hesitated. There's something else you should know. After she died, I threw myself into expanding the ranch, using Father's methods to build something lasting. The town thought I was crazy, but I needed to prove that being different, reading different, thinking different, wasn't a weakness. It never was, Eleanor said firmly. Just as being small never made me less capable. It just meant I had to find my own way of doing things. Exactly. Thomas's voice grew serious. Eleanor, I want you to be sure about this, about us. Marriage to me means sharing everything. The ranch, the responsibilities, the town's judgment. And, he gestured to the photograph, sharing Catherine's memory too. I'll always keep her in my heart. Eleanor touched her mother's locket, thinking of all the memories it held. The heart is big enough for many loves, Thomas. Past and present. She smiled. Besides, I think I understand Catherine better than most might. We both fell in love with a man who saw beyond what others expected us to be. Thomas brought her hand to his lips. I don't deserve you. Now that, Eleanor said firmly, is the only foolish thing I've ever heard you say. The photograph sat on the desk. Catherine smiled, blessing their clasped hands. Outside, the ranch hands were starting their day, horses nickering in the morning sun. And Eleanor knew with a certainty that filled her heart that she had found not just love, but understanding. The crisis came to a head on a sweltering afternoon when Frank rode in with news that Pierce's men were damming the creek. Eleanor was in the barn when she heard the commotion, carefully checking the legs of a pregnant mare. She emerged to find Thomas studying a weather-worn map spread across a hay bale, his jaw set in a grim line. He's trying to force our hand, Thomas said, as Eleanor approached. Without that water, half our grazing land becomes worthless by winter. The map was old, its edges frayed and corners reinforced with carefully stitched leather. Thomas's father had marked it with his distinctive system, not just boundaries and features, but weather patterns, cattle movements, and cryptic notations that only made sense if you understood his unique way of seeing the world. Look at this. Eleanor pointed to a series of marks along the creek. Your father wasn't just tracking water flow. These symbols match the ones in the ledger where he noted mineral deposits. Thomas leaned closer, his shoulder brushing hers. You're right. And these dates. He traced a pattern Eleanor now recognized as his father's way of marking the seasons. He was tracking something else too. Eleanor studied the markings, her mind working in the way Thomas had taught her to read his father's system. The water, level changes, not just with the seasons, but her eyes widened. Thomas, there's another water source. Look at how the symbols shift here, even during drought years. Frank moved closer, squinting at the map. An underground spring? More than that? Eleanor's finger followed a faint line. A whole network of them. Pierce thinks damming the creek will cut off our water, but these springs... She looked up at Thomas. Your father knew they were here all along. That's why he never worried about the copper deposits. The real wealth was always the water. Thomas straightened, hope kindling in his eyes. If we can prove the springs predate the territory's water rights laws, then Pierce's claim to the creek won't matter, Eleanor finished. The springs feed the whole valley. By law, he can't interfere with their natural flow. That's assuming. We can find them, Frank cautioned. These marks are 30 years old. Eleanor touched the locket at her throat, thinking. Not quite. Look at these newer marks. Different ink, slightly different hand. You've been updating the map, haven't you, Thomas? He nodded slowly. Father taught me to check the springs every season. I never knew why it was so important. I just knew. You knew it was part of understanding the land, Eleanor said softly. Just like the ledgers, just like everything else your father taught you to see differently. Thomas rolled up the map decisively. Frank, get the men together. We need to mark every spring before Pierce realizes what we've found. He turned to Eleanor. Would you ride out with me? I could use your eye for patterns. They spent the rest of the day on horseback, Eleanor on her bay mare and Thomas on Midnight, checking each location marked on the map. At every stop, they found exactly what Thomas's father had documented. Clear springs bubbling up from the rocky ground, feeding hidden streams that kept the valley green even in the driest years. Eleanor watched Thomas at each spring, seeing how naturally he moved across his land, how he understood its rhythms in a way Pierce never could. This was more than a ranch to him. It was a legacy of seeing the world uniquely, of finding strength in different ways of understanding. As the sun began to set, they paused on a ridge overlooking the valley. The creek gleamed like copper in the fading light, Pierce's dam an ugly blot on its natural flow. "We'll file the water rights claim first." "And think tomorrow," Thomas said. "Pierce won't know what hit him." Eleanor nodded, but her mind was already racing ahead. "We should do more than that. These springs, they're not just on your land, are they? They feed the whole valley." "What are you thinking?" "A water cooperative." Eleanor's eyes lit up. "If we can get the other ranchers to sign on, show them how the springs connect everyone's land, Pierce won't just lose his claim, he'll lose his ability to divide the community." Thomas stared at her for a long moment, then laughed. "You're incredible, you know that. You don't just see the patterns, you see how to use them to help everyone." Eleanor smiled, touching her mother's locket. "I learned from the best. Your father's map, your way of reading the land. You taught me to see beyond the surface, just like you saw beyond my height." The setting sun painted the valley in shades of gold and purple. Tomorrow would bring challenges, legal battles, community meetings, Pierce's inevitable resistance. But sitting there on their horses, the weather-worn map safely tucked in Thomas's saddlebag, Eleanor knew they would face it all together, each bringing their own unique way of seeing the world. Thomas was uncharacteristically nervous at breakfast the next morning, barely touching Martha's fresh biscuits. When Eleanor entered the kitchen, he stood so quickly he nearly knocked over his coffee cup. "Ride with me?" he asked. "There's something I'd like to show you before we head into town to file those water rights." The morning air was crisp, heavy with the scent of sage and early autumn. Thomas led them along an unfamiliar trail, climbing higher into the hills than their usual routes. Eleanor had long since learned to trust both him and her mare, letting the horse pick its way along the narrow path, while she enjoyed the way the rising sun painted the valley below. They stopped in a small meadow surrounded by aspen trees, their leaves just beginning to turn gold. Thomas helped Eleanor dismount, then reached into his saddlebag. "I've been working on this," he said softly, pulling out a wooden box about the size of a thick book. "Started it the day you figured out Father's ledger system." The box was a work of art. Carved into its surface were all the symbols from Thomas's father's mapping system, the marks for springs, the patterns that tracked seasons, the special notations that had helped a boy who read differently understand his world. But Thomas had transformed them into something new, weaving the symbols into an intricate design of mountain flowers that matched Eleanor's mounting block and Midnight's bridle. "Thomas?" she breathed, running her fingers over the delicate work. "It's beautiful. Open it." Inside, nestled on a bed of soft cloth, lay a ring. Not a traditional diamond, but a band of silver carved with the same patterns as the box set, with a small piece of copper ore that caught the morning light like a flame. "The copper's from the first sample Father found," Thomas said quietly. "The one that made him realize the real treasure wasn't in mining, but in understanding the land deeply enough to protect it." He took Eleanor's hands in his. "Just like the real treasure I found wasn't what anyone else might have been looking for, but something far more precious." Eleanor's heart thundered in her chest as Thomas went down on one knee before her. "I had a whole speech planned," he admitted with a soft laugh, "about how you see the world the way I do, not just the surface, but the patterns underneath, about how you understand that being different isn't a weakness, but a gift that lets us see things others miss, about how you make me feel tall in all the ways that matter." Tears blurred Eleanor's vision as she squeezed his hands. "But what it all comes down to is this," Thomas continued. "I love you, Eleanor Hayes. I love your brilliant mind and your gentle heart. I love how you handle scared horses and angry men with the same quiet strength. I love that you understand my father's legacy better than anyone else ever has." He took a shaky breath. "Will you marry me? Will you help me build something even bigger than Silver Creek Ranch? A life where we both get to be exactly who we are?" Eleanor pulled him to his feet, unwilling to let him kneel before her. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes to all of it." His Hands trembled slightly as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, just like everything else he'd made for her. "I was so nervous about the size," he admitted. "Kept measuring it against your mounting block carvings while you were working with that new colt." Eleanor laughed through her tears. "Of course you did. Just like you measured all those steps and platforms, so I'd never need to ask for help unless I wanted to." He drew her close, his voice rough with emotion. "I never want you to feel like you have to be anything other than exactly who you are. Not on our ranch, not in town, not anywhere." "Our ranch," she repeated softly, liking how it sounded. "Our everything," he corrected, and kissed her. The aspens rustled around them, their leaves catching the morning sun like countless tiny mirrors. The horses grazed contentedly nearby, Midnight's silver-studded bridle flashing as he moved. And in Eleanor's hands, the carved box held more than just a ring. It held the promise of a life built on seeing the world differently, on finding strength in what others might call weakness, on measuring worth not by inches or ounces, but by the size of one's heart. "We should get to town," she said eventually. "File those water rights before Pierce causes more trouble." Thomas smiled against her hair. "Already thinking about protecting our land?" "Always." Eleanor tucked the box carefully into her saddlebag. "Besides, I can't wait to see Miss Prendergast's face when she notices this ring." His laughter echoed across the meadow as they mounted, up ready to face whatever came next. Together, the Copper Creek Chronicle's wedding announcement caused exactly the stir Eleanor had expected. She found the paper on her desk that morning, the small notice somehow managing to both announce and disapprove of her engagement in the same carefully worded paragraph. "Mr. Thomas Montgomery, owner of Silver Creek Ranch and one of our territories, most prosperous citizens, announces his engagement to Miss Eleanor Hayes, formerly of Boston. The unusual match has sparked considerable discussion among local society, though Mr. Montgomery appears quite decided on the matter. The wedding is planned for early October. They couldn't just say, 'Congratulations,' like normal people." Martha huffed, setting down Eleanor's morning coffee with more force than necessary. Eleanor folded the paper with a small smile. "At least they didn't mention my height this time. Only because Augusta Prendergast is too busy organizing a protest of sorts." Martha lowered her voice. "Word is, she's convinced half the ladies' auxiliary to boycott the wedding." "Only half?" Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "I'm improving. Last week it was 3/4. The kitchen door opened, bringing the smell of morning frost and leather. Thomas strode in, looking more amused than concerned. "Well, my love, we've caused quite the scandal. Pierce just informed me that the bank's annual harvest dinner might have to be postponed. Apparently, several leading citizens are concerned about, what did he call it? The example we're setting for proper social order." "Proper social order," Eleanor laughed. "Is that what we're disrupting? Among other things." He dropped a kiss on her head, though Pierce was less amused when I showed him the water rights documentation. "Amazing how many other ranchers were willing to sign onto your cooperative idea once they understood the spring system." Eleanor touched the copper ring on her finger. "He can't fight the whole valley." "No, but he's trying." Thomas sobered slightly. "He's been spreading rumors about the ranch's finances, suggesting our marriage is some kind of business arrangement to save me from bankruptcy." "As if you'd need saving," Martha snorted. "Not with those ledgers Eleanor's been keeping." A knock at the door interrupted them. Frank entered, looking uncomfortable in his Sunday best. "Boss, Miss Eleanor, there's a delegation from town, the Reverend's with them." Eleanor's heart sank. She'd known there would be opposition, but she hadn't expected the church to become involved. Thomas took her hand. "We'll face them together." The delegation waited in the formal parlor. Reverend Stevens, Augusta Prendergast, and 3 members of the church board. Their faces ranged from concerned to openly disapproving. "Mr. Montgomery," the Reverend began, "we've come to express our deep concerns about this upcoming union." "Have you indeed?" Thomas's voice was dangerously quiet. "It's not natural," Augusta burst out. A man of your standing, marrying someone so capable, Eleanor suggested. Educated, or were you thinking of a different measure, Mrs. Prendergast? We merely feel, one of the board members said smoothly, that such an unsuitable match might affect the ranch's standing in the community. The bank, for instance. The bank, Thomas interrupted, has just reviewed our quarterly reports. Reports that Miss Hayes prepared, showing our highest profits in 10 years. Would you like to see them? This isn't about money, Augusta snapped. It's about propriety, about maintaining proper order in society. Eleanor felt Thomas tense beside her, but she squeezed his hand and stepped forward. You're right, Mrs. Prendergast. It's not about money. It's about love, respect, and seeing people for who they truly are. She touched her mother's locket. I came west looking for a place to belong, not realizing I would find someone who belonged with me exactly as I am. Reverend, Thomas added quietly, my father taught me that God doesn't measure souls by earthly standards. He taught me to see the world differently, to find blessings in unexpected places. He drew Eleanor closer. I've found mine. Will you help us celebrate that blessing, or will you let prejudice blind you to it? The Reverend looked between them for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, he smiled. Your father was a wise man, Thomas, and he would be proud of the wisdom you've found. He turned to his companions. I will be performing this wedding. Those who wish to celebrate God's love in all its forms are welcome to attend. Augusta Prendergast stormed out, taking 2 board members with her, but the third lingered, looking thoughtful. You know, he said slowly, my sister out in California married a Chinese merchant. Family was scandalized. Now he's the most respected businessman in San Francisco. He nodded to Eleanor. Sometimes the best matches are the ones that make us question our assumptions. After they left, Eleanor turned to Thomas. That went better than expected. He chuckled. Only you would call. That better? Well, we still have a reverend, and at least one ally on the church board. She grinned. Plus, you should see the books I've been keeping. Pierce won't know what hit him when the quarterly report goes public. Thomas gathered her close. Have I told you lately how glad I am that you're too short to be a proper bride? Yes, Eleanor laughed, stretching up to kiss him, but you can tell me again. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, the familiar handwriting making Eleanor's heart leap. She'd written to her family about the engagement weeks ago, but the distance between Montana and Boston made responses painfully slow. It's from Sarah, she told Thomas, who was pretending not to hover anxiously nearby. Her younger sister's letter was characteristically thick, several pages covered in her elegant script. Dearest Eleanor, she read aloud, sharing the news with Thomas and Martha, who had given up any pretense of not listening. Your letter caused quite the stir here in Boston. Mother cried, happy tears, she insists. Father beamed like he'd personally arranged the match, and I nearly scandalized the entire sewing circle by shouting finally in the middle of Mrs. Whitmore's drawing room. But more importantly, I'm on my way. By the time you receive this, I'll be halfway to Montana. Don't protest. You know you need me there. Someone has to help with the wedding preparations, and more importantly, someone has to meet this remarkable man who sees our Eleanor as clearly as we always have. Also, I'm bringing Mother's wedding veil, she insisted, though we may need to make some alterations, as she is, as you always reminded me growing up, unfairly tall. Eleanor's voice caught on the last words, tears threatening. There's more, she continued after a moment. Listen to this. I know some of the town's reaction has been difficult. Mother grew quite fierce when she read that part of your letter. You know how she gets when anyone threatens her cubs. But, Eleanor, dearest, from everything you've written about Thomas and the ranch, it sounds like you found exactly what you were looking for, even if it wasn't what you expected to find. Remember what Father always said, the best things in life rarely come in the packages we expect, though I suspect he was talking about that Christmas pony that turned out to be a library of books. P.S. Is your Thomas really as tall as you described? Because if so, your wedding portrait is going to be gloriously unconventional, and I absolutely cannot wait to see Mrs. Whitmore's face when I show it off at the next sewing circle. She sounds wonderful, Thomas said, smiling at Eleanor's obvious joy. She is. Sarah's the tall one in the family. She took after Mother's side, but she never once made me feel small. Eleanor touched her locket. She used to let me stand on her schoolbooks when we practiced dancing, saying it was only fair since I'd helped her learn her sums. Martha wiped her eyes with her apron. Well, we'd better get the guest room ready. When does she arrive? Eleanor checked the letter's date. According to this, tomorrow's stage. The next day found them all at the stage depot, Eleanor practically bouncing with anticipation. When the coach finally arrived in a cloud of dust, a tall, elegant young woman emerged, her traveling dress somehow still immaculate after days of travel. "Eleanor!" Sarah rushed forward, then stopped short, taking in Thomas's presence. She drew herself up to her considerable height, fixing him with a stern look that was somewhat undermined by her twitching lips. "So, you're the man who's stealing." "My sister, Sarah," Eleanor protested, but Thomas stepped forward with a gentle smile. "Not stealing," he said quietly, "just promising to cherish her as much as her family does." Sarah's attempt at severity crumbled. "Oh, bother. I was going to make you work much harder for my approval." She hugged him impulsively. "But anyone who looks at Eleanor that way has already won it." The ride back to the ranch was filled with Sarah's delighted observations about everything from the mountain views to the way Thomas had designed Eleanor's mounting block. But it wasn't until they were unpacking her trunk that she revealed her biggest surprise. "Mother and Father are coming too," she announced, pulling out the promised wedding veil. "They've already left Boston. Father said wild horses couldn't keep him from walking his Eleanor down the aisle." Eleanor sat down hard on the bed. "But the journey, their responsibilities, are less important than being here for this." Sarah sat beside her, taking her hand. "Besides, Father said something about wanting to meet the man who understands. That the best gifts often come in unexpected packages." That evening, watching Sarah charm the ranch hands with her wit and height-enabled ability to reach the top shelf of Martha's kitchen cabinets, Eleanor felt the last piece of her heart settle into place. Thomas found her on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains. "Happy?" he asked softly. "Complete," she corrected. "My family, our ranch, you." She leaned against him. "Though I suspect having Sarah here is going to make the town talk even more. She's never been one to hold back her opinions." Thomas laughed. "Good. Between her height and your strength, we'll show them that love comes in all sizes." Eleanor touched her copper ring, thinking of the family traveling across the country to be with her, of the sister who had dropped everything to help, and of the man who had seen past everything to love her heart. "We already have." The legal document arrived 3 days before Eleanor's parents were due to reach Copper Creek. Frank brought it in during breakfast, his weathered face dark with concern. The packet bore the territorial court seal and Clayton Pierce's signature. "He's challenging the original land grant," Thomas said grimly, scanning the dense legal text. "Claims Father's grant wasn't properly registered due to—" His jaw tightened. "Due to his different way of filling out the forms." Eleanor took the document, her heart sinking as she read. Pierce's lawyers had seized upon the unique way Thomas's father had completed the territorial paperwork. The same different way of seeing things that had made the ranch so successful. "This is ridiculous," Sarah declared, reading over Eleanor's shoulder. "Surely they can't invalidate a 30-year-old grant because the forms were filled out uniquely." "They can try." Thomas pushed back from the table. "Pierce is claiming Father's irregular documentation means the original boundaries were never properly established. If the court agrees, they could void the entire grant," Eleanor finished quietly. "Everything would revert to territorial control, and Pierce just happens to have an application ready to claim it." Thomas's voice was bitter. 20 years of building something different, something that works, and they want to destroy it because the papers weren't filled out in the proper way. Eleanor's mind was already racing, thinking of the ledgers, the maps, the careful documentation that had protected them before. "Thomas, where are the original grant papers?" "In Father's strongbox. But they'll just show the same unique notation, system that Pierce is using against us." "Good." Eleanor stood decisively. "Sarah, help me in the study. We need every document your father kept about the grant application." Hours later, the study looked like a paper storm had hit it. Eleanor and Sarah had spread documents across every surface, creating a timeline of the ranch's founding. Martha kept them supplied with coffee, while Thomas and Frank gathered supporting statements from longtime neighbors. "Look at this," Sarah said suddenly. "In the territorial records from that year, all land grants had to be verified by a federal marshal within 6 months of approval." Eleanor's heart leaped. "And your father's grant was verified by Marshal James Cooper." Thomas pulled out another document. "I remember him. He used to stay at the ranch when making his rounds. Thomas stopped, understanding dawning. "He had a son who read differently too." Eleanor was already pulling out more papers. "So when he verified the grant, he would have understood." "Father's notation system," Thomas finished, "and his verification makes the grant legally binding, regardless of how the forms were filled out." "But that was 30 years ago," Sarah pointed out. "Is Marshal Cooper still alive?" "No," Thomas said softly, "but his son." He turned to Frank. "Ride to Millbrook. Find Michael Cooper. Tell him we need his help remembering how his father made the law work for everyone, not just those who saw things the proper way." As Frank rode out, Eleanor studied the original grant papers with new understanding. Thomas's father hadn't just created a different way of documenting things. He'd found allies who understood that different didn't mean wrong. The marshal's verification wasn't just a signature. It was a statement that there was more than one right way to do things. "Pierce doesn't understand," she said, touching the copper ring Thomas had given her. "He thinks everything has to fit. His idea of proper to be valid. But your father built something better by being different." Thomas drew her close. "Just like we're building something better by being ourselves." Sarah watched them with bright eyes. "Pierce is going to regret this, isn't he?" "Oh yes," Eleanor smiled, "because he's not just attacking Thomas's inheritance now. He's attacking everything we believe in. The idea that being different is a strength, not a weakness." The next few days passed in a blur of preparation. Michael Cooper arrived with a trunk full of his father's papers, including personal letters about Thomas's father and the grant verification. Eleanor's parents reached Copper Creek just as Pierce's lawyers filed their formal challenge, but Eleanor hardly noticed the legal storm. She was too busy watching her father, tall, distinguished Jonathan Hayes, shake Thomas's hand with tears in his eyes, too moved by her mother's fierce hug, and whispered, "We're so proud of you," to worry about Pierce's schemes. That evening, as the family gathered on the ranch house porch, Thomas's copper ring caught the sunset light. "We'll need to delay the wedding," he said regretfully, "until this legal matter is settled." "Absolutely not," Eleanor's father interrupted. "I didn't cross half the continent to let some small-minded man's lawsuits stop my daughter's happiness. Besides," Sarah added with a wicked smile, "can you imagine Pierce's face when the judge who dismisses his case has to attend our wedding the next day?" Eleanor squeezed Thomas's hand. "She's right. We're done letting others decide what's proper. And for us." Thomas looked around at their gathered family, Eleanor's parents beaming with pride, Sarah plotting Pierce's downfall, Martha and Frank adding their own determined support. "You're right," he said softly. "Let's show them exactly what love looks like when it doesn't follow their rules." The wedding dress arrived from Boston in a box almost as tall as Eleanor. Her mother had commissioned it from their family's longtime seamstress, who had been dressing Eleanor since she was a child. But when they lifted it out, Eleanor's heart sank. Despite knowing her measurements, the seamstress had clearly made it for someone of more proper height. "Don't worry," Sarah said, Seeing her sister's face, "This is why I learned dressmaking. We'll make it perfect." For the next 3 days, while Thomas and Eleanor's father dealt with Pierce's legal challenge, the women transformed the dress. Sarah's clever fingers adjusted the proportions, while Eleanor's mother carefully restyled the train. Martha contributed. Lace from her own wedding dress for the new hemline, and even Augusta Prendergast's former maid, who had quit in protest over her employer's treatment of Eleanor, came to help with the intricate beadwork. "It's not just a dress anymore," Eleanor's mother observed, watching the women work together. "It's a statement." She was right. Every adjustment, every careful alteration, showed that beauty didn't depend on meeting someone else's standards. The final result was a gown that celebrated Eleanor's stature instead of trying to disguise it. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and cool. Eleanor stood before the mirror in her perfectly fitted dress, her mother's veil, now expertly shortened, floating around her shoulders. The copper ring on her finger caught the light, matching the autumn colors Sarah had woven into her bouquet. A commotion outside drew her to the window. Clayton Pierce stood in the ranch yard, waving papers and confronting Thomas. "You can't do this," Pierce's voice carried clearly. "The judge hasn't ruled on the land grant case. This wedding is a transparent attempt to influence the court." "The only thing transparent here is your desperation," Thomas replied calmly. "The wedding has nothing to do with the case and everything to do with love." "Love?" Pierce sneered. "Look at her. She barely comes up to your shoulder. What will people think?" "They'll think," Eleanor said, stepping onto the porch, "that love sees deeper than height." A collective gasp went up from the gathering crowd. In her perfectly fitted dress, with her head held high, Eleanor seemed to fill the space with a presence that had nothing to do with physical size. "Miss Hayes," Pierce started, but Eleanor cut him off. "Mr. Pierce, you've spent so much time measuring things by your own narrow standards that you've missed what really matters. This ranch thrives because Thomas and his father saw the world differently. The valley prospers because we work together instead of fighting over boundaries. And this dress," she smoothed the silk that fit her like a dream, "it's beautiful because we adapted it to celebrate who I am, not who others think I should be." Thomas moved to stand beside her, and Eleanor saw the moment Pierce realized he had lost more than a legal battle. The community had gathered not just for a wedding, but to celebrate what Eleanor and Thomas represented, the triumph of love and understanding over prejudice and proper appearances. "The judge ruled this morning," Thomas's lawyer called, riding up with a paper in his hand. "The original grant stands. Marshal Cooper's verification was legally binding." A cheer went up from the crowd. Eleanor saw Augusta Prendergast turn on her heel and stalk away, but others who had opposed them were now smiling, perhaps seeing something new in the way Thomas looked at her, or in how she stood tall despite her height. "Well," Reverend Stevens said, stepping forward with a warm smile, "since everyone's already here, shall we have a wedding?" They were married in the ranch yard, surrounded by family, friends, and even former opponents who had learned to see differently. Eleanor's father walked her down an aisle lined with autumn flowers, his face proud as he placed her hand in Thomas's. When Thomas lifted her veil, he didn't bend down awkwardly, as others might have expected. Instead, he knelt before her, making their eyes level, showing everyone that love finds its own way of fitting together perfectly. "I think," he whispered, as the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, "that you're exactly the right height to be my bride." Eleanor smiled up at him, knowing that their victory wasn't just about the ranch or the wedding. They had shown Copper, Creek, and themselves that the best kind of love doesn't try to make people fit some proper mold, but celebrates them exactly as they are. "We did it," she said softly. "We showed them a different way to measure what matters." "No, my love," Thomas replied, drawing her close for their first kiss as husband and wife. "You showed us all." The morning after the wedding, Eleanor sat at Thomas's desk, their desk now, holding the newly recorded ranch deed. Her name had been added alongside his, the formal script declaring them equal partners in both life and business. "It's not just a piece of paper," Thomas said, watching her trace their joined names. "It's a promise to the future." Eleanor smiled, thinking of all the documents that had shaped their journey. The mail-order bride contract that had brought her west, the height requirement notice that had nearly sent her home, the water rights agreement that had united the valley, and now this, official recognition that Silver Creek Ranch belonged to both of them. "Your father would have loved this," she said softly. "His unique way of seeing things carried on through both of us." "He would have loved you." Thomas pulled out the old leather-bound ledger. "Look what I found this morning." Hidden between the pages was a letter, the paper yellowed with age, written in his father's distinctive style. "To my son, and whoever is wise enough to see his worth." I'm writing this as I watch Thomas master our different way of reading the world. Some call it wrong, call him slow because letters and numbers don't sit still for him like they do for others. But I've seen how he reads the land, the sky, the hearts of animals and people. He sees patterns others miss, finds solutions in unexpected places. Whoever finds this letter will have discovered our unique bookkeeping system. You'll have understood that being different isn't a weakness, but a gift. And if you're reading this with my son, you're probably the person I've been praying he'd find, someone who sees the world as richly and differently as he does. Take care of each other and of this land. Build something bigger than either. Of you could alone, with love and faith in the future, James Montgomery. Eleanor wiped tears from her eyes. He knew someone would understand eventually. He knew you would understand, Thomas corrected gently. Even if he never met you. A knock at the door interrupted them. Sarah entered, her face glowing with excitement. "You need to see this." They followed her out to the yard, where a group of young ranch hands had gathered around Eleanor's mounting block. One of them, a boy who had always struggled with the regular record-keeping system, was explaining how he'd adapted Thomas's father's notation method to track the herd movements. "See, if you mark it this way," he was saying, drawing in the dust, "you can show both where they graze and how long the grass will last. Just like Mrs. Montgomery, showed us with the ledgers." Eleanor squeezed Thomas's hand, watching their legacy already taking root in the next generation. "Your father was right. We are building something bigger." The rest of the morning brought a steady stream of visitors. Eleanor's parents, preparing to return to Boston, promised to send more books on innovative ranching methods. The Reverend came to announce that the church board had unanimously voted to establish a school fund for children who learned differently. Even some of the ladies who had opposed their marriage stopped by, curious about the water cooperative and Eleanor's adaptations to the bookkeeping system. "We're changing minds," Sarah observed, watching another former critic leave with a thoughtful expression. "Not just about you two, but about what's possible when we stop insisting everyone fit the same mold." By sunset, Eleanor and Thomas stood on their porch now by legal deed and loving choice, watching the autumn light paint the mountains gold. The ranch hands were bringing in the evening herd, using the new tracking system that combined Thomas's father's wisdom with Eleanor's innovations. "I've been thinking," Thomas said, his arm warm around her shoulders, "about expanding the breeding. A program, like you suggested, not just horses but ideas." Eleanor looked up at him, understanding blooming. "You want to teach others your father's methods? Help them find their own ways of seeing things?" "Our methods now," he corrected. "Think about it. A place where people can learn that different isn't wrong. It's just different. Where they can discover their own strengths, like Father helped me discover mine. And like you helped me see that being small didn't mean being less," Eleanor added softly. "Exactly." His voice grew excited. "We could offer classes in adaptive ranch management, innovative bookkeeping, alternative horse training methods, show people there's more than one right way to do things." Eleanor's mind was already racing with possibilities. "We could start with the children who struggle in regular schools. Show them how your father's notation system might help them read in their own way. And then, Thomas smiled, knowing she was just getting started. And then, we show them what's possible when you measure success by understanding rather than conformity. She touched the deed in her pocket, thinking of all it represented. We'll build a legacy of seeing differently. Together, Thomas agreed, bending to kiss her as the sun set on their first full day, as equal partners in every way. 1 year after her wedding, Eleanor sat at her desk in the ranch office, composing a new kind of mail-order bride advertisement. The fresh page before her would soon be sent to papers across the East Coast. But this was no ordinary notice. Seeking women of extraordinary character for exceptional Western matches, she wrote, her pen moving smoothly across the paper. Height, appearance, and conformity to society's expectations are irrelevant. What matters is your heart, your mind, and your willingness to see the world differently. Thomas found her there, adding the finishing touches to her advertisement. "Ready to change more lives?" he asked, smiling at the stack of letters already on her desk. Correspondence from other unconventional couples who had found love in their own unique ways. "Listen to this," Eleanor said, reading from her draft. "Silver Creek Ranch Matchmaking Service specializes in connecting those who don't fit society's traditional mold. We believe that the best matches come from understanding hearts, not outward appearances. Every person has unique gifts to offer, if only given the chance to shine." She touched her mother's locket, now containing a tiny portrait of her and Thomas on their wedding day. "We're not just matching couples," she continued. "We're building a community of people who understand that different isn't wrong. It's just different." The proof of that philosophy surrounded them. The ranch had flourished under their joint management, their unique combination of skills, making it more successful than ever. The adaptive learning program they'd started had grown to include students from across 3 territories, all discovering their own ways of reading the world. Even Clayton Pierce had come around, his grandson now attending their special classes and thriving under Thomas's father's notation system. The boy, who had once been labeled slow, was now managing his grandfather's books with innovative methods that combined the best of both worlds. "Mrs. Whitaker stopped by earlier," Thomas mentioned, picking up one of the waiting letters. "She wants to partner with us, says she's learned that measuring compatibility by inches was short-sighted." Eleanor laughed at the unintentional pun. "Do you remember what she said when I first arrived, that I wasn't sturdy enough for ranch life? And now, look at you, running the most successful breeding program in the territory, teaching others to see their own strength." He drew her up from the chair, still marveling at how perfectly they fit together, despite their height difference. "You didn't just prove them wrong, love. You showed them a better way to be right." Eleanor added a final line to her advertisement. "At Silver Creek Ranch, we believe that love, like life, comes in all sizes. The only measure that matters is the size of your heart." As she sealed the envelope, the setting sun painted the office in shades of copper and gold. Outside, students were gathering for the evening lecture on adaptive ranch management. Young people who had once been told they didn't fit in were discovering their gifts, learning to see the world through different eyes. "You know," Thomas said, softly, "Father's letter was wrong about one thing. He wrote that you'd understand our way of seeing things, but you did more than that. You helped create a whole new way of seeing." Eleanor touched the copper ring that hadn't left her finger since their wedding day. "We all did. Every person who dared to be different, who refused to be measured by others' standards." She smiled up at him. "We're just making sure they can find each other." As they walked out to greet their students, Eleanor thought of that first day in Copper Creek, when she'd nearly let others' judgments send her running back east. How different her life would have been if she hadn't stayed, if Thomas hadn't seen past her height to her heart. But that was the real magic of Silver Creek Ranch. It wasn't just a place where two people had found love despite their differences. It had become a beacon for others seeking the same understanding. A place where being unique wasn't a flaw, but a gift waiting to be discovered. And that was a legacy worth any measure.